Welcome to Cowtown. This is not a real town. This is a fictionalized version of an old western town here in Wichita, Kansas. And it's got some real buildings and dozens of real old buildings, and they've fashioned it together into a town. They call it Cowtown because of the early history of Wichita. This is where the cattle drive ended because the railroad ended here, and you could get your cows on the railroad and get paid for them, and they could ship them off. And so this was a destination for so many cowboys in the 1870s, and that's when the city of Wichita grew, kind of started, and then it grew. And this kind of is a big outdoor museum to explain that history. So we're just gonna walk around. We're gonna go in a lot of the buildings. Definitely a cool place, very family oriented, but a lot of history. And if you're interested in that kind of stuff, then you'll probably like Cowtown. Let's go check it out. Here's a look at Cowtown. It's 23 acres, and it was built in 1955. And you enter here. This is from the kind of east side, the parking lot. You go through the entryway, and then you head into this first little section. That's a little bit of an introduction to the history of the area. It talks about early days of the area when Native Americans were here, and then the early cattle drives that drove the people to come to Wichita. Got a teepee here, and inside the teepee it talks about all that kind of stuff. The Chisholm Trail was the popular cattle drive trail that came from the south up to Wichita and made it to Cowtown. And then this is just the first of many buildings. There's like 54 buildings that are either original or kind of recreated to match the 1865 to 1880 time frame. And I think this is kind of like a early kind of trapper cabin. But you get to the kind of the main street here, and before you go down the street, there's an orientation building. You can watch videos about Wichita. They have a bunch of displays. So this isn't a historical building, but this just is like an introduction to the history, and so it's a good place to get started. And then you'll start walking down the dirt path here, and then we're going to kind of stay on the right side. We'll come back on the left side on the way back. But on the right side, 1868 is really the early days of the town, and the Munger House was the first house in Wichita, and these represented the Munger House. There's a little sign there that talks about that, and this was the first house in Wichita, which is kind of neat to see. And you can go inside, and they've decorated it like it may have been back then. And all these buildings, you can go inside and walk around and check them out. And then now you head down. Now it's 1872, and that's kind of when the town got going. And a lot of the businesses would have been popping up in Wichita. And each building has something like this, which tells the history of the building. About half of the 54 buildings, so I think 27 of the 54, are original 19th century buildings. And so in each of those buildings, it tells the history of the building. Sometimes they weren't exactly what they look like now. They may have been a different purpose, but it's pretty interesting. If you read all those, it gives a really good history of that kind of stuff. There's fun stuff like this, all kinds of wanted signs, and it's very, like I said earlier, it's very family oriented. The bank here is pretty neat. Whenever you see a building like this, it has some pretty cool things to think about what it used to be like. And I think a lot of times you worried about getting robbed back in those days if you were running a bank. So we continue heading. This will be heading west down this main street, and there's the general store, and once again made to look like it would have been. And this was one of the important buildings in all the towns, is general store, kind of like a grocery store or a hardware store, kind of everything in one. I always love looking at the old jails, and this was the old jail. And more history there about the jail. Would have been pretty wild to have to go in here and be stuck in here for a while, but that's the jail. So that's where we just were. Now we kind of keep heading west down this path, and a little bit of a walk down to kind of a farm area. And this just, they have animals down here. It's kind of, made to look like what a farm would have been. And there's several animals actually in Cowtown that you'll be able to see as we go. And here's a big farmhouse. And some of these buildings are, you can go in and you can literally go anywhere you want. Like I went and sat down on this couch when I was filming this video. But yeah, so it's a pretty cool area to explore. And then, that's the way I used to dry the clothes back in the day. Then as we start kind of turning around and heading back, you see all the different old tools they used to use. And you can see the river on the right. That's the Arkansas River. You can kind of see how it's laid out there. And as we hit the Empire Hall, I made a couple new friends. What do you think about Cowtown?
It's pretty good.
That's good.
What's your favorite part?
The
dentist.
The dentist? Oh, I haven't seen that part yet. Where's it at?
And it's upstairs.
Okay. Awesome. Could you? What is that? So, could you imagine what it would be like to live back in the 1870s? Would you want to live then?
No.
No.
And now we are back outside on the street, and we make a little right turn here, and you can see a little pathway there heading towards the river, walking towards the river. They put on a bunch of events here, so there's concerts and there's shows of different kinds, and I have been here a couple times for different events, but this is really the first time I've ever walked through and looked at everything really closely. The marshal's office is pretty cool because here on the wall they talk about Wyatt Earp, and I did a whole video about Wyatt Earp back in the day in Wichita, and he had a significant part of his life was living here. And so a lot of law history. Now that we're ready for dinner, we'll resume walking around. We head down towards near where the railroad is set up, and you have the elevator here, and kind of shows you how they would take the grain and it would go all the way up and load it up for the railroad. Railroad was obviously really important, and that was the reason the city grew, and there's a lot of stuff about the railroad you can check out. And then here in the stables they have all kinds of stuff to check out, and also some animals down here towards the end. Back outside, here's a stagecoach. Could you imagine riding that across the Kansas prairie? That'd be interesting. Look pretty comfortable compared to some I've seen. And once again, there's just so many different buildings, and you can spend hours and hours just cruising around and checking them out and reading about the history. So, but like I said earlier, if you got kids, fun place to bring them. They'll enjoy checking all these places out. But like me, if you're into history, this is a cool old hotel, and the hotel there, it says, was 50 cents. That's pretty amazing to think about, and it was twice as much if you wanted food. Here's the saloon, and it actually served food and drinks. So it was, if you're looking for something, take a little break during the day, check that out. Here's the dentist's office that the kids were talking about. The dentist was also like the doctor often, and so as we went upstairs here, and you see the kind of dentist offices, they were what people look to for all kinds of aches and pains, and shows here the medicine on the frontier. And one of the things that caught my eye was the toothache. Scratch gum with iron nail till it bleeds. I'm not sure if that's the advice I would take today, but interesting what they used to do back in the day. Now we're kind of starting to head towards the end of the trip here, and we get to the Wichita City Eagle. That's a newspaper, and in here was one of the, I guess you'd say, actors, and we had a chance to chat and talk with him for a second.
So they could tell the rest of the world there was no sin in Wichita. Our ink is up here, and the letters we put in this frame known as a chase, and those rollers are got ink on them, and they're waiting for you to turn this wheel. Putting ink in the letters, going up, getting more ink, pressing the paper, and now you're in the printing business.
And a couple buildings left. One of the final ones here is the school. I always love visiting old schools, and a lot of the towns I go to, sometimes there's a school at the town, and so you can imagine what it would have been like to be going to a school in the 1870s. And then a church, and churches and schools are in most of these little small communities back in the day. And so this was the final building that I visited, and then headed out towards the parking lot. So that was the tour of Cowtown. Hopefully you enjoyed it. It's open every day except for Monday. Like I said, Sundays are free, and $9 for most of the other time. Bring the whole family.
One hour later.